Today's topic is all about communication. Communication with your family, with yourself, communication at work, and how to use your power of communication to make you better. So our presenter this morning is Penny Bivens. Penny is a very good friend of mine. She's a mom, she's a friend, she's a working professional. I've seen Penny and I have been through some trenches together. We have lunches where I cry, we have lunches where she cries, we have lunches where we laugh ourselves silly, but she is a professional. She's currently a faculty member at Salt Lake Community College. She's managing director of Vivify, which is a consulting firm. She has 25 years working in corporate America, most recently with Intel, and she's owned several small businesses. So I'm going to turn the time right over to Penny and let her begin. So how about a nice, warm welcome for Penny Bivens.
So I'm so excited to be here today. I'm so nervous. I'm shaking like a leaf. I'm thinking it's a little bit from being excited to be with my tribe. I've been an Illuminate member from the beginning, and every time I come to one of these events, I get excited just because you can feel the energy of all these great women in the room. But I'm also really nervous. Because this is such an important topic and I have so much to share with you all today. I'm going to try to call you ladies. My habit is usually to say guys, but I'm going to try to say ladies since the majority of us are ladies in the room today. Before I get started though, I wanted to give a shout out first to Katie and to Tara Sunder, who have both believed in me as I transitioned from my career in corporate America and gave me confidence and support when I didn't have it for myself. I'd also like to give a shout out to my friends in the audience. Some have traveled from other states to be here to see me today. And to my youngest daughter, Sadie. So she's my mini-me. She's wise beyond her years, and in my presentation today you'll hear more about her, but I'd like to start with a little story to kind of calm my nerves because I'm better at stories. Oh, that's loud. So start with a little story about her, which is an example of a typical miscommunication at work. So back when I was pregnant with her, I was working at the Intel facility in Riverton, Utah, and was managing a small team of people at the time. And one day at work, my mom calls me to tell me that my most favorite cousin had just passed away. I don't know why she needed to call me at 2 o'clock, because it wouldn't have changed if she would have waited until 5 o'clock. But she was upset too, probably, didn't think much about it. So, of course, I'm a wreck. I'm heartbroken. I'm rushing into the ladies' room, and I'm in the ladies' room sobbing. Well, I didn't think it was anything I needed to really tell my team about. You know, I collected myself, I went home, and went about my work for the next week or whatever, and I come into work one day, and there's this beautiful baby blanket on my desk with all these notes of encouragement and support. I'm like, oh my gosh, what's this for? So people had seen me crying in the ladies' room, and they knew that I was pregnant. Obviously, I was very pregnant. And so with those two pieces of information, wild rumors flew around the office. Can you imagine what the rumor was? The rumor actually was that my baby was going to be born mentally handicapped. Yeah, two pieces of information, you know, fill in the worst of your imagination. And so I got this anonymous baby blanket. Well, Sadie is nothing. She is not mentally handicapped. She's kind of advanced. You'll hear more about her throughout the day today. But this is kind of a quick story to get us started about how communication at work is not just about the words that we say, and that miscommunication is more common than not. Okay, so I don't have a clicker today because my bag got stolen, and our AV guy doesn't have his clicker today either, so he and I are going to be doing, like, you know, hand gestures to advance the slides. So Katie gave me a really nice introduction, but I just wanted to add a little bit more context to the introduction so that you know why I'm here talking to you today about my most favorite topic, which is communication. I started at Intel in a marketing role, and then I moved into an HR communication management role. And so I've been doing professional communication for 25 years of my life. So I know the theory as well as I know kind of the practices from an application perspective as a leader and as a professional communicator. And then Intel left me, which you'll hear more about that later in the day. And I struck out and started my company Vivify that Katie talked about, where I help local companies create a thriving culture, primarily through communication and some other company practices. But it's not full-time. It's my passion. I love it, but it's not full-time. So I supplement that by teaching at Salt Lake Community College. And about 2 years ago, I got a call from a friend who's my boss who said, hey, come back to Intel for a while, we need you. So I'm currently also working at Intel doing more communication. What I'm trying to say is I'm trying to pack in 20 years of experience and a quarter's worth of material that I teach at Salt Lake Community College into 2 hours. So if there's interest in what I'm saying and you want more information, Salt Lake Community College actually offers this as an intact training that you can have at your company's location. So this is just a little for college credit. So this is just a little intro. Okay, so that's why I'm here, that's my background, that's why I'm speaking about this subject. So let's get started. My presentation is broken up to 3 sections. So the first section is basically just communication 101 theory. So we have the same language, we're operating on the same assumptions about what communication is. Then I'll go into 4 stories from my time at Intel, from my first time at Intel, where we apply some of that theory into practice. And then I end with some recent research on brain science and the communication differences and preferences between men and women. So as you probably know that I was in the advertisement, I have gotten so many people asking me about the 3rd section of this speech. So I'm going to try really hard to stay on topic. I do have an activity for us, so I'm going to ask you all to stay on topic or on time on the activity. So I'm hoping that I don't rush through that material at the end, because it's really important and powerful information. Okay, but before we get started, we all need to understand what is communication. So my teaching style is usually pretty interactive with my students. I think this is a small enough group that we might be able to get some interaction from you all today. So this is a question. So this is when you get a response. What is communication? Anybody have an idea? Throw it out there. What is communication? It's not on your handout, by the way. We'll talk about your handout in a minute.
Exchange of ideas.
Exchange of ideas. That's great. Anybody else?
It's spoken and unspoken communication through your body language and tones.
Yes, very good. Verbal and non-verbal communication, spoken and through your tone of voice. Excellent. Anything else? Listening. Yes, exactly. So essentially communication is not specific to a channel, it's not specific to a technology. It is really the exchange of information. It's a dialogue, it's not a monologue. So communication comes from the Latin word to share. And you can't share with somebody unless there's somebody there to receive it. And I think that's an interesting and important definition for communication that will help us going forward. So, and as you said earlier, communication requires somebody to listen. This is a Chinese character for the verb to listen. I like to call it listening with delight. So it starts with ears to hear, and we all assume that listening requires hearing. It talks to having the mind to think, so you can process the information. The eyes to see, that speaks to the nonverbal aspects of communication. And the heart. We don't often think about the requirements of the heart to actually feel the energy or the message behind what's being said. And then there's the undivided attention. And this is what's so lacking in today's world of multitasking. This is a rare commodity in these days. So the undivided attention is really what helps us focus on what's being said. So listening is an action, it is a verb. And so many of us do it habitually and passively that we don't think about it as, and don't spend the amount of attention that it takes to actually listen. So what are some good tips for active, effective listening? Anybody? Have some rephrase and repeat back, absolutely. So an example of that is, what I think I heard you say is, or do I understand this correctly? So some good rephrasing. Anything else?
Eye contact.
Eye contact, again, goes to this character, right? So we can actually have that next level of meta message conveyed. Very good. Anybody else?
Removing distractions, particularly iPhones.
Yes.
All the things.
Yes, removing distractions. Absolutely. That's the undivided attention piece. Yes.
Listening to hear, not to respond.
Very good. Listening to hear. So many of us wait to talk, which is different. You know, we're thinking in our head, what am I going to say next? Versus, what are they actually trying to tell me? Okay? Anything else? Yes.
Having compassion.
Having compassion. Empathy, yes. And we're going to talk a lot about that during the session today, so very good. And that goes to the heart piece. So one of the funniest responses that I get when I usually ask my students this question, you know, what's the best way to listen? And they look at me and they scratch their head and they go, well, you got to stop talking first. And it's so true. And I don't know whether it's talking in your head or actually talking over somebody, the act that stop talking is really important. So to get us all warmed up, we're going to move now into an activity where you're going to use your handout, where we're going to practice listening with delight. Okay, this is to get us relaxed. Actually, get me relaxed. You guys are already relaxed. And so that you can get to know each other a little bit at your tables. And we'll feed into some of our activities later in the session. Okay, so what I'll have you do is pick one of these stories that you're willing to share. And you're only going to share it with your table, so you don't have to be up here with me to share it. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to write down your thoughts about it. Use as much detail as you can, because then I'm going to have you actually talk for 2 minutes, which sounds like a short amount of time, but when you're talking for 2 full minutes, it is not short. It feels, you're going to have some space to fill in, okay? And your partner, you're going to get a partner, and while you're talking, your partner is going to be actively listening. We're going to use those tips we just talked about. We're going to do the listening with delight. Okay, is everybody clear on the activity? All right. So go ahead and figure out what question you're going to answer. Okay. So now we've had one partner share. Now we're going to go and have 2 minutes and have that partner or the listener, tell the person tell them what they liked about their story and what they learned from the story. Okay? We're going to do that for 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask for a whistle again, and then we're going to switch. And again, this is a part where we want to stay on track with this activity, so we don't run out at the end time at the end. Okay, is the instructions clear? Okay, listener, it's your time to talk. Ready? Go. Okay, I hesitate to turn the time back over to you to switch your partner. I mean, keep your partner, but now it's the person who hasn't told their story gets to tell their story. Okay, 2 minutes. Ready? Go. Activity we're not going to do. You guys are out of control. Yeah, you guys are out of control. I'm just going to completely lose the crowd. So maybe over lunch, or if we end early, we'll come back to the second half of this activity. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a teaser. And then this slide is, I like this picture because it shows the listener first. So I wanted to ask, does anybody have any thoughts about what was easier, listening or talking? Listening. Why was that? You're not as vulnerable when you're listening. Okay, good. Anybody else?
Interesting. People just have interesting lives.
Interesting. Right. Stories just suck you in, right? Exactly. Anything else?
But I also think that it was an equal, for me, it was an equal sharing of information. There was equal communication, equally listening and equally speaking.
Equal listening and equal speaking. So did you feel heard?
Totally.
Yeah. Did it feel like different than usually when you're talking to somebody who's not trying to actively listen? Did you feel any difference? Have rapt attention or maybe better memory of what they said? You had a comment back there?
What I noticed when it is equal is you felt a greater confidence in being able to speak. As we learned from that story, that there's something to take away from that, and you were like, I wish I could do that.
Right.
You know, there's confidence.
So when you share equally and when you trust the other person is listening, it gives you confidence in being the speaker, right? Exactly. There's a comment.
That's one word that I was going to use, trust.
Trust.
This person that I just met
Yeah.
trusted to share something that's important to her.
Yeah.
And it gives you back that sense of maybe I make a difference.
Yes, yes. So one of the things when you actually feel heard is that connection between the two people. Even if you were talking to a complete stranger, it went from 0 to 100, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, right? Very fast. So it's amazing how powerful that can be. Yes?
But I also think as women, we have an innate ability to empathize and listen and be there for other women. It's
Yes.
when you're communicating women and man,
Yeah.
man and woman, it's completely different dynamic.
Completely different with men and women for sure, and we'll talk about that toward the end, for sure. Yes, and I have a man here who wants a comment. Go ahead.
So I love doing this kind of stuff. I wish I was as good at communicating when I had an agenda or I had something I already wanted to have happen as I am when I'm just sitting exchanging information. Once I have an opinion and an agenda,
Right.
I'm crippled.
So
I'm listening.
hopefully at the end of our time together, you'll learn some tips that can help with that. That's one of my goals actually today, is not only to kind of change your perspective about communication in general, but to give you some tips on how to make it easier and how to avoid misunderstandings, how to dissect misunderstandings, kind of the secret decoder ring. So come back to me at the end and let me know if what you're going to talk about helps you with that. Okay, comment one here.
I think it was easier, even if it's a stranger, you build trust right away. If it's a coworker you work with and maybe you don't trust them, that active listening isn't happening because I'm listening to
Yeah.
voices in my head. So it was easier to trust a complete stranger than
Yeah.
somebody that I really
You're so right, and we're going to actually talk about that. So very good. The amount of trust in a stranger is unburdened by past relationships and the voices in your head. We're going to talk about that. So in the second half of this exercise, which we're going to postpone, a lot of the people that I've done this exercise with have had, massive breakthroughs and tears and stuff. So it's probably good we skip that for now. So moving forward then, we get into why do we communicate? Why do we communicate?
To survive.
To survive. Yes, we communicate to survive. We do. And there's a lot of reasons as adults that we communicate after that. But initially, when we're born with an innate ability to communicate. And if you can't communicate, you don't survive. It's that simple. And as we develop a little bit more, we start to understand the world around us as infants and our place in the world based on how people talk to us, based on how they react to our ability to communicate. So if I cry and I cry and I cry and nobody comes, I don't exist. As an infant, I don't exist. I only exist as an infant based on the reaction of other people. Okay? Secondly, we communicate as infants to build relationships with people so we can influence them. I cry and I cry and I cry and I cry, and my mom comes and feeds me, and I cry and I cry and I cry, and my mom comes to feed me, and I cry and I cry and I cry, and my mom comes to feed me. I was like, okay, I trust her. Yeah, she's a good one. I'm gonna keep her. Right? So, and if we're not able to communicate, we don't survive. And the other thing that as we develop is we ascertain, am I being supported? Am I being threatened? Every time we communicate. So I'm crying and my older brother comes to see why I'm crying. And I'm like, okay, he doesn't have milk. I'm gonna stop crying and smile so he doesn't, get out the pillow or whatever, So really, our ability to influence people and to assess, are we being supported? Are we thriving? Are we surviving? Is about how people react to us. And that begins at birth. It's subconscious, it's unconscious, and it affects how we communicate through the rest of our lives. And we'll get back to that in a minute. Okay, so we all go through life thinking communication is easy. Don't you think? I mean, what else do you do as often as communicate, other than breathe? I don't know about you. I communicate more than I eat, so that's out. Communicate more than I sleep, so that's out. But, and we kind of assume that it's easy, don't you think? That assumption actually is rooted in the 4th century BC with Aristotle. He's seen as the forefather of rhetoric, which is the ability to influence others, or the art of persuasion, if you will. And back in those days, the idea was that if I used the right words in the right order, I could convince anybody to agree with me. That was the art of rhetoric. And it was a game. I volley to you, you volley to me, I volley to you, you volley to me, and then we get, it kind of gets messy when there's a disagreement and there's conflict, but essentially that was where it began. And then in the 1950s, they came out with this communication model study. Has anybody seen this model before? Where there's the sender, the message, and the receiver. The sender's job is to encode the message, and the receiver's job is to decode the message. It's like, okay, it's not as easy as words, because in reality, words are empty vessels. Okay, so this is a huge concept for me. If you haven't written anything on your first paper on the, where it says we're in the beginning on the book, I would write this down. Words are empty vessels. Words are empty vessels. So since the 50s, we've done a lot of research and added to this model. So if you want to, the words are filled up, those empty vessels, those words are filled up with meaning based on the relationship that you have with the person, which we just talked about a little bit in the listening exercise, based on how much more information that you have from your senses, what you see, what you smell, even what other noises you're hearing in the environment, as well as the challenges or the opportunities in whatever channel you use, if it's face-to-face or if it's texting. There's a huge difference, right, in how you interpret those same messages, those same words. So I'm going to walk you through a little example with a simple word, hi. It's 2 letters. Who can misunderstand the word hi, right? Well, it depends. So if it's my daughter coming home from school saying hi, it's just basically, hey mom, I'm home from school. But if we had an argument that morning, her hi would have probably a different tone. And it may be kind of an apology, like, ooh, I'm going to test the ice, so she's still mad at me, Hi, Mom. Yeah, what if she says hi to the cute boy in the hallway? Hi. It's completely different meaning in the same 2-letter word. Words are empty vessels. Okay? So one of the things that we don't often remember is that that there's noise in the environment. So we all know about physical noise. So if she says hi to that cute boy in the hallway and there's a crowded, noisy hallway and he doesn't hear her, it's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But there's also two other types of noise that we don't often think about. One is called psychological noise. And we'll talk a lot about psychological noise in the end of the presentation. But the psychological noise, what if that cute boy is so preoccupied by this upcoming test, right? So the hallway is quiet, and she says hi to the cute boy, and he doesn't hear her. She doesn't know that he's got all this noise in his head from his test. What do you think she thinks about herself? Yeah, he doesn't like me. He doesn't like me. And what we don't often remember is that that noise impedes the delivery of the message, which then affects what that feedback is to the sender, which can either promote more communication or less communication, right? Whether or not that conversation continues. So do you think she's going to go say hi to him in the future? Well, maybe, maybe not. Knowing Sadie, she would walk up and smack him in the head. But it does affect the future. So the other thing, the other type of noise is called semantic noise. And semantic noise is when somebody has a different meaning in the word that you're using. Or they have a prior history with that word, they have a negative connotation or an emotional attachment to that word that is completely beyond your knowing that, right? It's completely beyond your understanding of that word. And one of the words that I have come across that has had that semantic noise, which, you know, we understand that when it's people who English is their second language, or they come from England and they speak proper English, you expect to have some semantic noise. But what we don't expect is when you have that same misunderstanding in people that come from the same culture and even the same family as you. And so the example that I have here is with my oldest stepson, Anthony. And growing up in my house, whenever he would do something, you know, put away his pants or unload the dishwasher or whatever, I'd be like, hey, thanks. And I could never understand why he would get so agitated with me. Like he would be, you know, literally offended that I thanked him for doing something that I appreciated him doing. And I never understood why he was agitated. And when I asked him about it, he'd be like, oh, I'm not agitated. He couldn't really verbalize the nonverbal cues that I was picking up from him. So he goes on a mission, he comes back, he goes to Spain and doesn't speak English for 2 years, out of my house and out of his mom's house, and comes back and he did something and I thanked him and he stopped and he said, this is the first time I actually could hear what you intended by that. In my mom's house with my stepdad, when we wouldn't do something we were supposed to, he would say, oh, thanks, with such biting criticism that he had assigned a lot of negative, you know, emotion to the word thank you. And so he heard my thank you as criticism when I meant it as appreciation. So I point that out because if you're ever in a situation where you're using a no big deal word for you and you're not getting the response back from whoever you're communicating with, or it's like an unusual or unexpected response, it may be that they have a subconscious attachment to that word that they may not even know about, right? So just be aware of that. Okay, so now I'm going to blow your mind just a little bit more. Well, it blew my mind when I learned about it anyway. So within each of our heads, we have a lot of noise. Back to that psychological noise and the voices in our head. And so the example that I'm going to talk through in this concept is how do you react when somebody comes up to you and says, hey, can you do me a favor? For me, I'm terrified. I'm like, oh my God, are they asking me for a minute or 2 months of my life? I don't know, you know? And so I instantly go through this process, which I didn't know that I did this until I read this model, and you probably do the same thing. But the first thing I do is I go, okay, who's asking me for this favor? What do I think of that person? Are they my boss? Are they my neighbor? Are they a slacker? Do I respect them? Do I trust them, right? And then I think, well, why are they asking me? Am I special? Do they like me? Do I have some special skill? Right? So it's kind of my perception of what they think of me. And then I think, well, what do I think of myself? Am I a nice person? And we as women are known for saying yes more often than no, right? And we get to that last piece of the assessment and we're like, oh, I'm a nice person, I have to say yes. I guess I won't sleep for 2 months, right? Or what I've come to learn actually is to try to be supportive in my voice tones and look them in the eye and say, well, tell me what you need, which is non-committal, and you get more information before, and you can have your brain reset to say, okay, do I really want to do this favor or not? So in communication then, it's super complicated because we're actually in a 2-person conversation, having a conversation with 6 people. We've got 3 people in that person's head and 3 people in that person's head. We've got all this environmental noise. You've got the channels, you've got the message. It's like no wonder communication is so hard. And that leads me to Wheel. He was a professor in Helsinki, and he coined this phrase called communication usually fails except by accident. So it's kind of Murphy's Law of communication. So what I find interesting about this is so many of us, all of us, are in situations where there's misunderstandings frequently. And instead of blaming the other person, if we can dissect what's happening, especially in times where communication really matters, whether it be in your family, something really emotional, something really important at work, if you can kind of think through this model and dissect some of the things that might be going awry, whether in your head or in their head, you can approach your communication a lot more consciously, with a lot more empathy, and with a lot better outcomes. Okay. So any comments on that before I move forward? Any thoughts? Because I need a drink of water. Was it interesting, or am I just a geek? Because I like this kind of stuff. Did you learn something new? Okay, comment back there.
I think it's fascinating when you take those principles and you apply them into a professional environment.
Yes, and we're going to do that next.
And that to me, I think, gosh, Penny, I need to hire you to come into my team and do this presentation.
Oh, that would be a great idea. I like that idea.
Because I think that because of the perceptions that we have outside of the workplace, everyone has their own individual lives and their backgrounds and their history, that oftentimes they bring those into
That's
the
right.
workplace. And without knowing those things about who works for you or works with you,
That's right.
you can have a lot of miscommunication and
Yeah.
conflict between teams.
Yeah, and knowing this model, then you have a shared language, and you can come up to somebody and say, are we having a semantic noise problem here? And they don't even know what you're talking about, right? Say, what emotional attribution do you have to the word thank you, for example? Comment there.
Well, it's more of a question,
Okay?
because you're dealing with communication and stuff. So there's been a lot of conversation on how millennials communicate and stuff, because they're used to screen time or different methods of communication,
Yeah.
say on social media or whatever. And I remember I read a Harvard business study a few years back, maybe in 2012, 2013, where they were, the more screen time a person has, the less ability they have to pick up on those unspoken
Right.
communications. So the nonverbal stuff, they have a harder time actually recognizing and understanding the nonverbal cues.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that being an issue?
I find lots of issues with massive screen time. The ability or the desire to prefer screen time versus personal interaction is by far, I think, the greatest. In my classes, because I teach mostly millennials, we spend some time talking about that, and they're very uncomfortable because they've had so much screen time. They're uncomfortable in the world of real people. And so I think we're just at the beginning of understanding what the ramifications of that. So I would encourage all of you probably are already doing that, but make sure your family puts their phones away at dinner and stuff like that. Okay, so moving along, great comments, I'm just trying to stay on track here. So why does all this matter? So this is about leadership, this is about business communication, and what I tell my students every week when they come into classes, I ask them a question, what's the purpose of business communication? It's to inspire action. Whether we're not trying to get them to buy our products, buy our services, if we're at work, we want a promotion. Pretty much everything that we do in business for a communications perspective is to inspire action. And so I ask my students every week, and I'm asking you now, what's the purpose of business communication? Inspire action. So that's something else you should write down, because if you have that little mantra in your mind, you can actually think through that in communications that matter. What action am I trying to inspire? That affects your channel, your message, how you approach your audience, etc. So a non-business example of that is my mom wants me to call her. Okay, that's this action she's trying to inspire. And when I call her, she complains about the fact that I haven't been calling her, which makes me not want to call her. So it is not inspiring the action that she wants. And I've tried to teach her this concept, and she's getting better, thankfully. But that's just a simple example of how you think, what do I really want out of this? And how do I approach it so I can inspire the action I desire? And if you think about what is the job of a manager and as a leader, it is to inspire action. You get work done through other people. Your job is to provide the vision, motivate, safety. Your job is 50% or more communication. So really, being a leader and communicating is inextricably linked. You cannot lead without communicating. So that's why all this matters. Okay, now we're done with the beginning section. How am I doing on time?
10 minutes until 10.
Perfect. I'm right on time, you guys. I'm so glad I skipped the second exercise. I'd be behind time. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some stories, and we're going to apply the theory that we just talked through. And the reason why I'm going to talk about stories is because the human brain has been programmed from the beginning of time to listen to and to remember stories. It's how we, for generations, passed down where the best hunting spots were and how to cook that great meal. It's through storytelling. So we're going to go stories. The first story is about communicating to anybody. The second story is how do you communicate up to your management. The second story is about how do you communicate down to your team. And the fourth story is about communicating organizationally. Now, when I say communicating up to your management and down to your employees, that sounds kind of condescending and pejorative, right? That kind of sounds bad. And I always would get offended by that until I'm a geek and I do some of these research, so I said, where did that come from? It was actually from a 1969 study, the New England Telephone Company, and they wanted to understand why the people on the switchboard knew more information than their executives. Which we all laugh because we know the answer now, but I guess it was unknown then. And they came up with, through their research, this model that says that communication in organizations work like gravity. So if you're in an executive or leadership position, you communicate and it flows downhill so fast. Sometimes faster than you want it to, right? And it really is unimpeded by filters. And so what gets communicated down is relatively accurate because it's assisted by gravity. But if you're in the employee ranks and you're trying to get information up, it is like pushing a rock up a hill because you're working against gravity. And that gravity is in the form of filters. We have internal filters that says, oh, I can't say that because I want them to like me. And we have external filters, which are layers of management and other things. And if you've ever read the book Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg, she talks about how even in cultures or company cultures where they have open communication expectations, there's a lot of fear. It's kind of innate fear, and it has to do with the position power of people, where it takes extra courage to actually get that communication up. So I found that study interesting, and in fact, instructive, as you'll learn in one of these stories, as I learned to communicate as a leader. So with that said, are you ready for my first story?
Yes.
Okay, now you have to keep me honest here because I could go on, and this is my favorite part of this presentation. Okay. So my first story is called Dead Checks. I started, like I said, in Intel and marketing. I was living in Arizona. That's where I met my friend Rachel, and wanted to move back to Utah because my family, my mom and dad are here. And Intel opened a new building in Utah for HR function. So I made a career move, left a management role, came to be an individual contributor in the payroll department as a communicator. In the first week that I'm in my new job, the director of payroll comes bebopping into my office. Hey, what's up with that dead check prezo? And I was so taken aback, I didn't even know what to say. I mean, first he had this slightly curly hair that was really messy because he drove a convertible and he was just back from lunch. And like he was all bouncing and it's like, I couldn't even hear his words. I'm like, and I couldn't figure out what did dead chickens have to do with payroll. I was like, maybe I made a bad career move here, I don't know. So I'm sitting there, I'm like, oh, well maybe he's trying to be social or funny, you know, and I'm not sure what I said, but it became very clear that was not what he was trying to do. So he stomped out of my cubicle and he comes back and he puts a printout of an email on my desk, and payroll had sent out an email to hundreds of employees saying, and the subject line was dead checks. Not you, but does anybody else know what a dead check is? It is basically, and this is, you know, dating myself a little bit before electronic deposits, but it was when you issued a paper check to an employee and it had not been cashed for some period of time and the check had expired. And so on the books, in the payroll books, it has been shown as spent, but the money was just kind of floating there, right? So they had this problem. They wanted to get this money figured out on the books, and none of the employees responded to that email blast. So a prezo, by the way, was his word for presentation. So he wanted a presentation from me as a communication professional about, okay, what am I going to do about this dead check problem? So I did a couple things. I changed the subject line to something along the lines of, your money, we have it, you want it. Instead of having a blast email, I did kind of a mail merge functionality and said, Penny, you have $3,267.27 that will expire, and we will get to keep your money by this date if you don't call us. If you've lost a check, or if you have questions, call this number by this time. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. Of course, legal had to have their say on it, so it was a lot longer than that. But you get the idea. So what do you think the response was to that email? It was overwhelmingly positive. So 90-something percentage, and the payroll director thought the rest of the employees had died or something. So I'm not sure. Maybe they just didn't care about the money, but it was a really good response. So what do you think the lesson, and this is the second part of your handout in the little table, there's a place that you can write down the key lessons from each of these stories. What do you think the key lesson is from that story?
It's the terms people use, and they use slang and other things that often other people don't use. I'm a CPA and I've never called it a dead check.
Yeah, very good, very good. So that's what we would call in communication terms, what's in it for me. So understand your audience, use a language that they understand, that they know, that they care about. Phrase it in a way they will prioritize reading your message. We are so bombarded by messages. I mean, I don't know, hundreds of emails a day, you've got advertising, your kids' homework, mail, paper mail still. I mean, we're just so bombarded with messages, we're all overwhelmed. And so if you really want the attention from your communication, make sure that you phrase it in a way that your team can, or your audience can prioritize it. Yes, I have a comment back there?
Especially in digital communication.
Especially leaders, as communicators, make sure that you're really aware of all of what you're communicating, not just your words.
Isn't there studies that say that nonverbal communication has more effect than the actual?
There are studies on the internet that say that, but I couldn't find any credible sources, so I didn't want to quote it, but yes. Generically, yes. Nonverbal is a lot more powerful, and it's universal, right? So it's little kids or adults, right? Okay, next story. So, again, all 4 of these stories are from Intel, and some of my Intel friends are here, and so they're laughing because they know these stories. So fast forward a few years, and the payroll communications had made an impact, and the other HR departments decided they needed to hire their own communicators. And so we were having this unfederated group of communicators hired, and I had come from a marketing world that had experienced both a centralized and a decentralized organization. And I was so passionate. We had to have this group centralized. We had to be a team, or we would work cross-purpose from each other. I mean, you hire communicators, what are they going to do? They're going to communicate, right? And so these poor Intel employees are going to get overwhelmed by thousands of HR emails if we were, working against each other instead of for each other. So one of the leaders at the time, his name was Neil, and so I had a proposal about how we needed to centralize a team. I didn't necessarily need to manage it, but we needed to be a team. So I had charts and graphs and data, presentation materials, PowerPoints, and this key player on board, and that key player on board, and presentation after presentation. And I could just see his eyes glaze over, and he'd just be like, I don't get it. No. And I'm like, I'm so right. And I just couldn't get through to the man. And so I was friends with his admin at the time, and said, look, I just need one more meeting with Neil. She goes, no. He told me to cut you off. He's tired of this subject. And I'm like, oh, but he's making the wrong decision. And she says, I tell you what, I'll tell you when he's in his office without meetings, but you didn't hear it from me. Like, okay. So now I'm like, this is a completely different format. It's informal, it's a drive-by, I have maybe 10 minutes, and so how do you communicate in those sort of situations? Well, I took all this massive amounts of data, put it on one piece of paper, made it super simple. Here's the situation, here's the options, here's my recommendation. Well, it was fascinating, first, that he let me in his office. Secondly, that he actually gave me his attention for 10 minutes. And those 10 minutes, communication actually happened for the first time. He actually caught that ball. He actually heard my message. He actually listened. I don't know if he listened with delight, but he listened, right? So the bad news is he still didn't agree with me. The good news is he did make a decision which I thought inched us toward the right direction, and I thought it was a really productive outcome. I felt happy with that, and I was from then on I supported his decision until he left. And he went on then to become the director of the corporate Intel Communications group, and got the nickname there 9-Minute Nil. Because he would ask people to come into the meetings with him with an executive presentation or an executive summary. And within 10 minutes, he could ascertain, does this topic have strategic fit? Is it a priority? Am I going to delegate it, or am I going to kill it? In 10 minutes. And he could ask the most uncomfortable, insightful, powerful questions to get to that decision so quickly. And so it's so against my nature. I'm a context person. I like to know the background and the history and the data. Obviously, I've been boring you with data tips all day. But I've been so impressed with him. And he's gone on to become a VP at Intel. He leads a huge organization now and is very successful. So it's a big lesson for me that all these 27 pages of PowerPoint, I do for myself. I thought I did it to present it. No. I do that research, I do that pre-work, because that's how my brain thinks. That's what I need to have the story straight and the data at my fingertips. But I do not need to punish my audience with all that information, right? And so it's kind of an art to figure out, what does my boss need to make the decision? And what is that preparation that I need to help them make that decision. Okay, so what do you think the key lesson is in that story?
Know your audience.
Know your audience, that's good, yep. Anything else?
Get to the point.
Get just the facts. Just the facts is the primary lesson that I wanted to convey. There's one other one that's relevant to the third part of the speech. Yes?
Keep it simple.
Keep it simple, yeah. Again, the higher up in leadership you get, the more broad the information is that you have to digest and process. And it's not their job to know the details, right? So keep it simple. The other thing is, what do you think, or do you think all my passion for the subject helped me or hurt me? It so hurt me. It so hurt me. So the other key lesson here is mute your emotion. I mean, I'm sitting there going, I'm so passionate, can't you see that I'm right? And he's probably thinking, oh, she's so passionate, she's irrational, right? So it's really important, particularly when communicating up, and be really aware of that when you're communicating with your male colleagues. Because it depends on the relationship, of course, and not trying to make it too generic, but be really cognizant that your emotion may not help you. Okay, third story. Do you guys like these stories? Yes. Oh, good. I like telling them, so thank you for listening. Okay, here's a few years later. Neil has moved on, and I convinced everybody else to agree with me, and we had a centralized communication team. It started, right? It started as a small U.S. team, and then there was a corporate change, and everything went global. So all of a sudden, I was managing a global organization of about 100 people. First time in my life, I had started managing managers. We had to change our service model. We had new cost targets to hit. We had all of this transition as people were figuring out, who their new bosses were to me. And so we had some chaos, we had some infighting, our clients were starting to get unhappy with us, and we were trying to build this organization over the phone. And face-to-face communication is more powerful, so my big idea was to get through this transition by bringing my global leadership staff together for a week-long kind of retreat. And earlier in my career, I had gone to the Bear Lake Training Center. Has anybody been to the Bear Lake Training Center? For us, it's incredibly beautiful. It's remote. It's a facility that has private rooms and bathrooms, but there's like a communal kitchen, so you cook together, you eat together. There's activity rooms, there's meeting rooms, and so you're pretty much there 24/7 for a week. And I had been on teams before that had massive transformations being at the Bear Lake Training Center, and my admin at the time had been there too. And so we were so excited about having this retreat with the staff that I was not paying attention to the fact that as I'm talking about it in all of my excitement in my staff meetings, my staff they were like radio silent. They're like, yeah, okay, right? My requests for input were being ignored, so emails weren't being responded to, and I'm like scratching my head. So I'd bring it up in the staff meeting, like, so you guys have got your travel ready, you have any inputs on the agenda, and kind of quiet, and a few people had enough courage to come to me and say, I don't really know about this retreat thing. And I was so excited about it, and I just knew I was right. Because I'd been there before, that I figured that, I could convince them to agree with me, and I had met their concerns. Well, here it is the Friday before the retreat starts on Monday, and the HR person shows up in my office. One of my staff members had escalated to HR that the retreat was a safety concern. And HR was asking me to cancel the meeting. So I couldn't cancel the meeting because I had people on flight from Israel and China. They were already in the air, right? So we changed the logistics and we decided to have the meeting at the site. And people stayed in hotels and whatever. But that weekend was a really hard weekend for me. I mean, I was humiliated, I was disappointed. I really wanted to go to that retreat. I was angry, I felt betrayed, all sorts of emotions. But at the end of the day, I decided that how I reacted to this would set the tone for my staff and for my organization for the rest of the time we were together. And what was that action I was trying to inspire? How did I want them to behave, right? So Monday morning comes in and they're just nervous. You could just feel the tension. You could, cut it with a knife. And I'm well known for having an agenda that is way too full for what can be done in a humanly possible amount of time. And so they're shocked as I'm like, okay, we're gonna put the agenda aside, we're gonna start with a discussion. And I said, I wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank you for trying to communicate your concerns to me about this retreat, and I want to apologize for not hearing you. I want to apologize for not listening. And so let's have a conversation about the expectations we have in communicating amongst ourselves. And so we were a communication organization talking about communicating with each other. We ended up having a fantastic face-to-face. The organization ended up being very successful with cost and quality and satisfaction. And for me personally, and I'd say most of the people on that staff, it was a high point of our career, not only because of the business results, because of the teamwork that ensued from that experience and that trauma. And we would refer to that event as the Bear Lake Coup. And it was part of our little, we'd laugh about it and say, oh, remember when? And but it really, even though it was devastating at the time, it was actually a blessing that it happened. Okay, so what do you think the lesson is from that story? Listen, very good. Did he already have that up there? No. Okay, so listen, yeah. So as we go back to the concept of up-down communication, right, and how communication flows, I had forgotten, or didn't know, I don't know at the time, that a whisper from your employees, you need to hear it as a shout. It took a lot of courage for them to say, hey, I don't know about this retreat, which I blew off as a minimal concern. And I should have heard it as, hey, there's a problem with this retreat, So really, you have to try harder to listen to what your employees are trying to say when you're in the management leadership role, because there's filters. We talked about those filters. So that's the first thing. What's the other lesson, do you think, from this story?
I think how you reacted to
Yes.
the reaction and how you were going to turn it around instead of the emotion
Right.
of being hurt. And
Yeah, so the other lesson is really, you are responsible as a leader to set the tone for your organization. So, and when you set that tone, that's the standard by which people will behave. So if you react in the way that you want your staff to react, you lay that foundation. Okay, last story. Whew. Okay, so I'm at time. I've got to make this story short. So a few years later, so this story is an organizational, how do you communicate to an organization? And this is not about me as a communicator, this is me as a recipient of this communication. So it's 2007, we're at the beginning of the Great Recession. The HR organization had done a great job in transforming and outsourcing, offshoring, consolidating, and eliminating. And so the office building that we worked in had more open cubes than filled cubes. It was very vacant, right? And at the same time, the leader of the site, named Larry, decided to install a fence at his house. So, I don't know, people either knew where he lived or were his neighbors or whatever, but there was a rumor that got started at work that said, the site is closing and we're all losing our jobs because Larry's putting a fence in his house so he can sell it, because he's moving back to Oregon, okay? So kind of like the first story we started with on how, you know, unintentional communications can create rumors. So he decided at that point to be very purposeful in his communication to the site. He announced that yes, there were process to sell the building, that it was going to take about 2 years to sell commercial real estate, that we did very important work and he needed us all to stay employed. He didn't want us to quit and leave because the company was counting on us. I mean, we processed people's payroll and did reimbursements and really important work in the lives of the employees at Intel. But asking somebody to be in limbo for 2 years is a long time, right? We knew that we had a choice at the end of whenever the real estate sold, approximately 2 years, we would have a choice to move with the company or leave with the company with a package, but we didn't know any of those details. But I have so much respect for him because in every opportunity, every formal and informal meeting, he would bring up the topic. Oh, I bet you guys are thinking about the sale of the building. Well, let me tell you the update. Or, hey, I know you're thinking about the sale of the building, but we're in a quiet period right now and I can't talk about it, right? So we didn't like what was happening, but we felt so respected by the company and supported by the information that most of us, even those of us who decided to leave the company, still have a love, I would say, for that company because of the way we were treated. Lifelong fans and customers of the products because of it. Okay, so that's the organizational story that I cut really short. What do you think the lesson is there? Transparency is a good one, yes. Repetition, yeah, and that's the lesson really. So Larry was sick and tired of talking about the sale of the building. He would say, I'm sick and tired of talking about it, but I know you want this information. So there is never enough information for employees, and silence is a false calm. Just because you don't hear employees doesn't mean they're not worrying about it, doesn't mean they're not thinking about it. It means that they're spreading rumors because they're filling in those gaps with their worst nightmares, you know, around both of those rumors we talked about. Okay. So now, this is a summary in case you wanted to fill out your chart of all of the lessons from all of the stories. And I just want to close on one type of communication that's really powerful for leaders, and it's recognition. Everybody likes to be told they're doing a good job. And for those of you who have been managers or are managers and leaders, it is a really hard job. It's a thankless job, and it's a lonely job. Right? Because primarily recognition is given to the employees. And so my little soapbox here, my little plea is that we can be role models in communicating up to our management, into our teams, and being positive and recognizing people for good work that they do. It not only helps them, motivate them, but it helps inspire the intrinsic motivation within yourself and makes your job a better job. So I don't have a story to share about recognition, but it's a little soapbox for me that I just wanted to kind of close communication practices of leaders with, because that's, I think, something that's not talked about enough and it's really important. Okay, are you ready for the last section? Okay, I have to breathe really deep and heavy for this one. Yes. So first off, there's a ton of research on this topic. You'll see in your handout, I put together a recommended reading list. I've listed some of the sources. And I just want you to know that my head is stuffed full of information. I'm going to try my best, but I do have notes up here I might refer to just so that I give you the accurate information. Secondly, I wanted to say this is a controversial subject. Okay, it's a subject, the difference between men and women is a subject that makes men and women uncomfortable. And there's a couple reasons why. One is, if you talk about differences, people can feel like they're being objectified or slandered, right? Either the men or the women can feel like they're talking bad about me. Secondly, there's this idea that if we point out differences, that we're adding validity to the difference, and it's working against our need to be equal, or our desire to be treated with equality, right? So pointing out differences can create an environment where decisions are made in the which to the detriment of the people in minority. So this is an important concept because in most places in the world, women in the workplace are still the minority. So our different is compared to the majority, which is set by men. So our different can be seen as bad and wrong. And so there's been a lot of effort saying, let's not talk about differences. But it denies who we truly are. And so there's a lot of pre-qualifications for this subject, but it's really important, and I think it's a detriment not to talk about it at all, and there's a lot of new research on that. Comment?
I just have a question too, because what crosses my mind personally is thinking too that this is very binary. We have a lot of people in the workplace who are trans and non-binary as well. Is the research really uncovered? Does that reflect that? Is this really looking just at like, I don't want to get too pure, but essentially cisgender, so people whose gender expression matches.
So your question is whether or not it talks about anything in between male and female, but let me just say, part of what makes me personally uncomfortable about talking about this is because it's not true. We are all individuals. I mean, so I say that the differences being not true. What I mean by that is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. But it feels uncomfortable to put everybody in this bucket here and everybody else in that bucket here, when in reality, think of it more like a continuum. And these are two ends of the spectrum, and we all fall somewhere in between. Okay? So what I'm trying to show are the two extremes, and to be instructive. But it's not meant to categorize anybody. But that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. So a lot of this work is based on Deborah Tannen, and she wrote a book called You Just Don't Understand, where she says that men and women are raised in different cultures. So she talks about it being cross-cultural communication and likens it to people who are born in the US versus people who are born in England. So she presents this as two equally valid approaches to communication, and I really like that approach in thinking about that. So do you agree that men and women are raised in different cultures? Okay, do you have some examples? I mean, we're willing to... Okay, right here.
Given a doll versus a truck.
Given a doll versus a truck. So the toys that we're given to play with, absolutely. Right here.
Women are allowed to cry for
Yes, what's allowed, what's expected of us is completely different in what's the acceptable behaviors, completely different, yes.
I also think that there's a difference. My dad wanted to go first. I'm the first child. He raised me as a boy, not, physically, but taught me more things. I played baseball, I played football, I did more male-dominant things. And so now as an adult, in the business professional world, I relate more on the male side of things, and I'm penalized for that because I don't cry.
Yeah.
Because I am not female enough. And so
Right, and we're going to talk about that actually. But your point is that how we talk to our kids differ, right? And that helps to train their brains on how they experience their world. So the way that your dad talked to you was more male gender than normal. I didn't get to play softball. I was told, no, girls are supposed to cook. So expectations, toys, colors, language, and what's really interesting is that not only is their environment different from how their parents talk to the different gender children, but how they talk to themselves. So I'm going to quote a study from 1982 by a couple of anthropologists where they, for 20 years, studied 3-year-olds, okay, at play. So at 3, we're barely verbal. And they're studying them outside of their home, so in preschools. And although they do have some mixed gender play, at that age they prefer to be in single gender groups. And some interesting things that they observed is that boys preferred to play in groups, large groups, like 8 to 10. They preferred games that had clear winners and losers. They preferred games that had lots of rules, and they enjoyed arguing about the rules. They also spent a lot of time boasting about what rule they were good at versus, somebody else. And that was what they enjoyed, how they enjoyed playing. Girls, on the other hand, preferred small groups, primarily one-on-one. Their games they had no winners and losers. It was more about playing house and playing school. You be the teacher, I'll be the student. You be the mommy, I'll be the baby. And they took turns. Their play was all about negotiating the differences in relationships. And when they looked at it from the lens of what does win and lose mean in the girls' world, they came up with the concept of the third wheel. We all know the third wheel, or the fifth wheel, or the seventh wheel, right? It's the odd man out, odd woman out in that case, odd girl out. But it's really in the woman's world and the way the girls played, losing meant you weren't part of the circle. Okay? So having those different, and some would argue innate, and we'll talk a little bit more about brain science in a minute, but having those differences that early and away from your home really affects how our worldview, which, go back for just a second. I forgot to also mention that I have the graphic here, Mars and Venus, from John Gray's book, even though he doesn't specifically talk about cross-cultural communication, it reinforces that idea. Okay, so that's why that's there. So we have different worldviews based on our upbringing and our play groups. So in a man's world, they see the world a lot more hierarchically than women, typically. Again, these are huge generalities. But in a hierarchical world, they expect to be separate and different. They celebrate independence. What makes them miserable is being in a one down position, right? They look for asymmetry. They conquered the mountain, they won the mountain, they earned it, and I don't feel bad for earning it because that's my goal, right? Our world, the women's world, is more about a complex network of relationships. Okay? We are worried about, or we listen for, when we talked about filters and psychological noise earlier, we listen for tones of voice, body language that says, am I in the circle or am I out of the circle? That's the meaning that we assign to words. Okay? Because words are empty vessels. Men are more listening for, am I in a one-up position or down position? Am I being pushed around, right? So what makes us miserable is being excluded. What makes men miserable is being pushed around. So what I think is really interesting about this construct is when you think about a couple of work situations. One is offering help or support, or offering concern. So in a woman's world, a world of connections, and our intention in offering help and support is meant to increase that connection and to let them know that we're there with them. But if you think about it from a hierarchical position, can somebody who is at the bottom of the totem pole help somebody who's at the top of the totem pole? In a hierarchical world, the answer is no. So by offering somebody help, the meta message that you're sending to somebody who sees the world hierarchically is that I'm better than you, I'm better off than you, and I know it because I can help you. Okay? This is maybe an emotional or subconscious way to hear that message. And like we pointed out earlier, it's not just men and women. My current boss here was raised with a bunch of brothers, and I think she's more over in the independence hierarchical column. So it's not just gender, but it's being really cognizant of those filters. Communication only happens when that message is received, when that ball is caught. And it has to go through all of that noise and all those filters. And so it's less about what you're intending to send and more about what's being received. So be aware of that, because this is it was huge aha for me. Okay, so next is some tips for just general tips for communicating given these different worldviews. So one is for women, where we, in our play groups in age 3, we really try to get consensus, and we really try to avoid the discomfort of being different and better than your peers. And so we tend to offer suggestions and ideas with a disclaimer. We try to make everybody in the room feel like they're at the same level. Okay? That does not do any good for us in a hierarchical world. Because for people who are expecting the world to be in order, that basically puts us on the bottom. Okay? So just offer your idea outright. And don't feel bad about it. I mean, I think that's one of the things that women, and we'll talk about brain science here in a minute, but we feel bad when in some cases, when we're seen as strong or seen as the leader or seen as better than the other people. The other thing is, just assume that you're understood. We're constantly checking for consensus again and enrolling people and making sure that everybody's engaged. And part of the does that make sense question that I hear as a habit that I have. Does that make sense? Did that make sense? Is trying to connect with people and to draw them into the conversation. But it puts you in a one-down position because it's seen as being self-deprecating in a hierarchical view. So instead of saying, does that make sense, which implies, oh, I can't communicate very well, so you must not be able to understand me, say, what do you think? Okay, because that's a more assertive, it's a more direct way to ask the same question and get the same result of connection. The other thing is to give concrete requests. So part of the boys' play group, they gave orders. That was part of what they like to do, is give and receive orders, and that's part of their world. In the girls' world, they gave suggestions, and they had discussions, and they made agreements, and then they went off and did it, right? And so these two worlds come together, and we try to use the same things that worked for us in our play groups, and it's not to our benefit. So instead of saying, oh, the trash needs to be taken out, which I don't know about you, but my ex-husband never heard that. It just went right over his head. You have to look him in the eye and say, will you take out the trash? Which is like, sure, fine, it's no big deal. And it's not that he's a bad guy, but that's just not how he was raised to pay attention to requests. So make their direct requests. And then this last bullet is talked a lot about actually in some research in the book by Sheryl Sandberg called Lean In. And it's really a sad reality. And it's amazing, I think, that we as women have become as successful and powerful as we have been and are in so many positions of authority because, as I said earlier, our style of communication is really compared to the majority. And we've all been accustomed to male leadership as the model for authority. And so we come in and approach it from our female ways, and we're seen as weak. But we come in and we approach it from the male's ways, and we're seen as unlikable. And there's actual research, and women contribute to this as much as men do, that we expect authority to be male. Okay? And so be really cognizant of that double blind and don't contribute to it. So women have to this point, and we're going to hopefully end with more inspiration than that, but to this point, we've had to give up likability for success, where men are more liked the more success they are, the more successful they are. So it's inversely related for women, and we're part of the problem. Okay, so moving on to brain science with that kind of not very fun topic there about the double blind, and we're going to get into now some research by Luann Brizendine, and she has a degree in neurobiology from UC Berkeley. She then went to Yale and got a medical degree, and then she went to Harvard and got a psychiatrist degree. So then she moved back to California and has been studying and opened lots of centers for mood and science and brain science for the last 20 years. So she's written a couple books, The Female Brain and the Male Brain, where she talks about kind of the newest technologies in brain scanning and imaging, which has kind of given us some insights to the difference in brains. So she's careful to note that she grew up in Berkeley at the time of the uprising of the feminist movement, and her initial thought was that the increasing rates of depression in women was because of the male patriarchy oppressing women, which is why we're all so depressed. And she says she's since gone on with brain science to clarify that's not true. And so her message is that our biology is our foundation, and we should understand it, and then we can, once we go from there, add, social practices and laws and whatever to enhance our lives. But we need to understand the foundation first. Okay, so men and women's brains are 99% the same. So I just want to say that. 99% the same. So we're talking about a 1% difference. So similar to what we were talking about in the different genders, what I'm going to be saying are kind of two ends to the same continuum, right? It's the juxtaposition that I'm trying to bring out. Even when adjusted for difference in body size, men's brains are 9% bigger than women's. And in the early days of brain science, that bigger size was attributed to being more intelligent. Okay? What they found with the newest technology is that women actually have the exact same number of brain cells. They're just more densely compacted into our skulls. They've also done tons of intelligence tests and found no statistical difference in intelligence between men and women. Okay? But with this brain scanning technology, they're able to see what parts of the brain light up as we do different activities. So when we're in love, when we're doing a math problem, when we're speaking, our brains are using different parts to do the same activities. Our hotspots are different, which is fascinating to me. Now, I'm not a neurologist, and I probably will misspeak some of these brain areas. So instead of trying to pretend like I'm a scientist, which I'm not, I put the impact of what the differences are up here. So women have 11% more circuitry in the areas of language and hearing than men. Okay? And we all know that normally girls develop language skills a couple years before boys do. It's also been found that women speak on average 20,000 words a day versus men speak on average 7,000 words a day. It's because we have more brains in that area, right? So Brizendine points out in her book that some cultures were offended by that difference and would put clamps on the woman's mouths or tongues to prevent them from talking because they didn't see it was an advantage. Fortunately, we're past that in this country. The other part of the female's brain is we have more circuitry where we can observe emotions. Okay? So when a female fetus or baby is born, for the first 3 months of their life, they have a 400% improvement between the ability to make eye contact and gaze and engage in the face with other people. For boys, they have no improvement. They're born with the ability that they have. 400% change in 3 months for women, for girls. Okay, so the neocortex, which is the front part of our brain, which is for focus and impulse control, is larger in women than men. The area of our brain where what they call the worry center is larger and more active in women. It makes us self-conscious. That's part of the things that it does. It makes us worry about lots of things that, lots of contextual information. And then when we remember things, because we have those bigger centers, we remember more of the context of it, where the men's memories are more about the facts and figures. Ours is more about the emotion because we have more circuits in that. So you can have this great memory of your wedding that it's not that your husband wasn't there or doesn't care, it's that he doesn't have the brain capacity to remember it in the same way as you do. Okay? So we also have passed our limbic system to kind of the internal core of our brain, which is the non-verbal part of our brain. The bigger ability to process non-verbal and contextual information. Okay, and so Brizendine says this is the biological reason women have intuition. There is a biological foundation for the term of the gut feeling, right? And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And we, of course, experience more emotion, which means that because of this, we're more prone to depression. It's not the male patriarchy that makes us sad. It's our own brains. Okay, so for men, and I just have to say that as I've shared this with a few men, they get really envious of our brains. So I think it's as I've read this research, it's really the female advantage is kind of the strengths of our brain. We'll talk a little bit about what the male advantage is in a minute. But male brains, they have 6.5 times more gray matter, which scientists believe is used for information processing. They have 2 times more, parts of their brain, two times more to identify threat, territory, and aggression. So the fact that they respond with fists, where sometimes we don't, it's because we don't have those circuits to feel that threat. We don't have those circuits to feel that same level of territory protection that they do, right? And they have 4 different parts of their brain are dedicated to sex. They have 2.5 times more brain matter dedicated to sex than women. The study is for 85% of 20 to 30-year-old men. They think about sex once a minute. Women the same age think about it once a day. Okay? So for some of the men that I've shared this with, they've found that to be really a disadvantage, really a barrier to get over in being successful in their careers. Okay? So where women have an 8-lane highway for processing language and empathy and context and memory, men have a small country road. Men have a, Chicago O'Hare Airport for processing sex. We have a small private, airport along that country road. So, and we'll talk a little bit about why we've developed that way. But before we go there, I'm going to talk about when this happens and get into the difference from the female brain, okay? So men and women, or boys and girls' brains are exactly the same until 8 weeks into life as a fetus. At 8 weeks, the male fetus is flooded with the adult levels of testosterone. Okay? okay? And that testosterone kills off the parts of the brain that we develop for language and empathy and all those other great things we just talked about. So by halfway into the pregnancy, boys and girls' brains are biologically and chemically different. So she just gave me a time check. Biologically different in 8 weeks of life. Okay, and so then when we're born, we go through 2 years of hormonal differences, same boys and girls, and then from 2 years to puberty, boys and girls both are pretty much androgynous. Their hormone levels drop. Okay, boys go through puberty, and then their hormone levels are pretty much stable. It drops a little bit after 50, but it's pretty much stable for the rest of their life. At puberty, women get hit by a complex cocktail of hormones. We know this, right? And honestly, back when I was in the middle of the throes of this, I would get really pissed off when somebody would say, oh, is it your time of the month? Like, no, this is real. But in reality, the brain science shows that women's hormones change every week of the month, every month of their life. Okay, so Brizendine says that the impact of that hormone imbalance cannot be underestimated in our perception of reality. And so where we have these great brains that make men envious, they have this great standard, natural, normal, hormonal level that make us envious. So we have those differences. Okay, one of the other things that Brizendine said that I thought was interesting is that with the hormone therapy that's being developed, that women are having more and more ability to manage their perception of reality and contribute to their success in the world when they're not trying to have babies than ever before. And she likens that liberation to something like the contraceptive pill. So I'm not personally a proponent of hormone therapy, but it's interesting to see that perspective. Okay, so why is it this way? Why is it this way? When you think about it in evolutionary terms, it all makes sense. Okay, we are the only humans on the planet, we are the only animals on the planet that give birth to nonverbal, helpless infants that stay that way from anywhere from 2 to 23 years. Right? So we as women evolutionarily needed to understand what was this baby trying to communicate to me with facial expressions. So we had to care for them. They were nonverbal. And we also had to survive to do that. And so we've all heard about fight or flight. Recent research about fight or flight is that is a man's response to threat. Because if you think about it, back in evolutionary terms, men are out fighting saber-toothed tigers and men from other tribes. And so they can assess the threat and say, okay, can I beat this guy? I'm gonna fight. Or can I run faster than the tiger? I'm gonna run, right? Women were at home taking care of the children. What was our biggest threat in our world? The men in our lives. The men in our lives were the biggest threat that we needed to create survival techniques for. And our survival technique primarily is what's called tend and befriend, which is what we're all doing here today, which is building these tight female networks. And we still see that in some primate behavior today, that if a male becomes overly aggressive, all of the females come to the rescue of the female being threatened, because together we're more powerful. And so losing those ties, those close female ties, has a biological response because it is what kept our foremothers alive. Okay, the other thing that we do is we try to talk ourselves out of it, right? If you're feeling threatened by some man that you know, back in the caveman days, if you can talk yourself out of it, you're going to survive. So it makes sense that our language centers were more developed. What's even better is if we can avoid the threat in the first place. So we have so much of our brain dedicated to processing nonverbal, contextual information that leads to our gut feeling. Because we get that little spidey sense that says, I shouldn't walk down this hallway, and we avoid the hallway. We avoid the threat. And our brains have developed that way to help us do that. Okay? We also, can't run because we're carrying a child. And so because of that vulnerability, we have to be more cognizant to the threats in the world, which is why our worry centers are so much bigger. We think about so much more things as being threatening to our home and to our children for survival. So that's why we're built that way. And so I want to talk about what I think is our superpower. And with all superpowers, too much of it can be a bad thing, right? One of the things we just learned is we have brain circuitries assigned to being self-conscious. So much of our brains are dedicated to being aware of all sorts of nonverbal and contextual clues, and it can create a negative critic in your brain, and the self-talk that you give yourself is, I'm not good enough. We worry, we're self-critical, we see so much more context. So we need to be really cognizant that we can take what is powerful and good for survival and turn it into something bad into today's day and age. The other thing, what I think is our true superpower, is this gut feeling, this intuition, the biological foundation for this gut feeling. But with technology and living in a male-dominated world, we're pretty much taught to ignore it or to overthink it, which is what I do, right? Like, I know that doesn't feel right, but it's just not logical, so I'm going to ignore it, and then I end up wishing I had paid attention. So I just encourage you to be aware that it is valid, and then take baby steps to have courage to follow through with your intuition. If you're at the grocery store and you get this urge to buy batteries, buy the batteries. You don't know why you need the batteries, but I bet you your flashlight needs them when you get home, right? That you can't really verbalize, and you can't spot the memory why you need them, but it's a low-risk investment. Buy the batteries, build your ability to listen to and have the courage to respond to your intuition. So the other thing that we need to do to listen to our intuition is we need to silence our neocortex, all this logical thinking, because our intuition is part of our brain that is nonverbal, okay? It doesn't have language to speak to us. That's why we feel it in our gut. That's why we get those spidey senses elsewhere in our body, all right? So we're going to do a little exercise now. So I want you to pick one of these questions and have it in your head, as I'm going to invite my friend Rachel up here, and she's going to teach us how to quiet our mind, our neocortex, so we can listen to our intuition. Now, like I said earlier, Rachel, I met her at Intel in marketing long ago. She's a good friend of mine now. She's since left Intel. She's here representing the Tao Healing Center of Chandler and the Sedona Mago Retreat. She's a master healer. She's following her passion after Intel to heal the planet one soul at a time. So please help me in welcoming Rachel.
And your armpit. And let this arm come down. And now we're going to tap our chest again. I'm going to tap like, and now come down to the upper rib cage and your belly. You can stay above the bladder. Okay, now we're going to tap our legs. So we're going to come down the front of our legs Tap the front of your thighs, down to your knees, your calves, the top of your feet. Now the back of your ankles, back up to your calves, back of your knees, your thighs, and your bottom. Ooh, feels good. Your lower back. Now come to your side, to your hips. And now we're going to tap down the sides of your legs. All the way down. Ankles. Inside your legs. Back up. Inside your legs. And back to your hip joints. And back to your lower belly. And now just brush down. Now close your eyes again. Now feel your body. Just notice any sensations you're feeling in your body. You might notice something a little different. Maybe some tingling, maybe some vibration in your fingers.
Thank you, Rachel. I've just got one slide, kind of some closing thoughts. I have taken the Stress from Strength workshop from the Sedona Mago retreat, and I would highly recommend it. It was fantastic. It was life transformational for me. So I appreciate you showing us how to tap into our intuition so we can better manage our self-talk. And if we are better at communicating with ourselves, we'll be better communicators in general and better leaders. And so I'm going to bring us out of our intuition for a minute back to our neocortex with a few closing thoughts, and just say, you can probably tell from the last 2 hours with me that I feel very passionate about this subject. You know, we hear as kids, sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt me. And that is so not true. If you think about communication more broadly, and actually more positively than that little ditty, it is through communication that every religion, every nation, every company, and every relationship exists and continues. In my view, it is the most powerful and most pervasive thing on the planet. So when communication really matters, at home or at work, put in a little bit of extra effort in preparation. Figure out, what is that action you're trying to inspire? Who is that person that you're communicating with, and what do they care about, right? Be cognizant of all that noise, and then fall into what we are biologically programmed to do, which is to communicate. Communication and leadership is inextricably connected, and women and that's one of women's biological advantages. So women are really powerful people. And we from the beginning of time have been, in charge of wisdom and healing and strength in tribes. And in this day and age, I think that we have lost some of our true power as women, our true essence of female power. I mean, in a sense, I think we had to. Back in the days of the 70s and the feminist movement, we encroached on the male power, I believe, to become as successful and to survive like we have. But we're at a phase now where we have powerful positions and authority in almost every realm. We're still the majority, but we're there. It's time for us to honor a new phase of feminine power, one that relies on what we are innately good at, what our biological strengths are. We are innately intuitive. We are able to process massive amounts of contextual information to approach problems in different ways. Okay? So honor yourself and don't try to encroach on the men's power, and yet honor their power too, because we all benefit from men being comfortable being men. We don't want them to be women, and they don't want us to be men, and the world works better together when we're in harmony. Okay? So I hope this talk was helpful. I hope it was entertaining. I hope you learned some things, and I'd love to hear from you afterwards during lunch. Thank you for your time.